On the other hand, I was aware that arguments have not been wanting to prove the existence of a real and definite limit to the atmosphere, beyond which there is absolutely no air whatsoever, but a circumstance which has left out of view by those who contend for such a limit seemed to me, although no positive refutation of their creed, still a point worthy of very serious investigation. On comparing the intervals between the successive arrivals of Encke's comet at its perihelion, after giving credit in the most exact matter for the disturbances due to the attractions of the planets, it appears that all the periods are gradually diminishing. That is to say, the major axis of the comet's ellipse is growing shorter in a slow but perfectly regular decrease. Now, this is precisely what ought to be the case. If we suppose the resistance experienced from a comet from the extremely rare ethereal medium pervading the regions of its orbit, for it is evident that such a medium must, in retarding the comet's velocity, increase its centripetal by weakening its centrifugal force. In other words, the sun's attraction would be constantly retaining its greater power. And the comet would be drawing nearer every revolution. Indeed, there is no other way of accounting for the variation in question, but again, the real diameter of the same comet's nebulosity is observed to contract rapidly as it approaches the sun, and dilate with equal rapidity in its departure toward the aphelion. Was I not justifiable in supposing that Pfaall's that this apparent condensation of volume had its origin in the compression of the same ethereal medium I have spoken of before, and which is dense in proportion to its vicinity to the sun? The lenticular shape of the phenomenon, as also called the zodiacal light, was a matter worthy of attention. This radiance, so apparent in the tropics, and which cannot be mistaken for any meteoric luster, extends from the horizon obliquely upward and follows generally the direction of the sun's equator. It appeared to me evidently in the nature of a rare atmosphere extending from the sun outward, beyond the orbit of Venus at least, and I believe indefinitely farther. Indeed, this medium I could not suppose confined to the path of the comet's ellipse, or to the immediate neighborhood of the sun. It was easy, on the contrary, to imagine it pervading the entire regions of the planetary system, of our planetary system. Condensed into what we call atmosphere at the planets themselves, and perhaps at some of them modified by considerations purely geological, that is to say, modified or varied in its proportions, or absolute nature, by matters volatilized from the respective orbs. Having adopted this view of the subject, I had little farther hesitation. Granting that on my passage I should meet with atmosphere essentially the same as it is on the surface of the Earth, I conceive that by means of the very ingenious apparatus of M. Grimm, I should be readily being able to condense it in sufficient quantity for the purpose of respiration. This would remove the chief obstacle in a journey to the moon. I had indeed spent some money in the great labor in adapting the apparatus to the object intended, and confidently looked forward to its successful application if I could manage to complete the voyage within a reasonable period. Any reasonable period. This brings me back to the rate at which would be possible to travel. It is true that balloons, in the very first state of their ascension from the Earth, are known to rise with a velocity comparatively moderate. Now, the power of the elevation lies altogether in the superior gravity of the atmospheric air compared with the gas in the balloon, and at first sight it does not appear probable that as the balloon acquires altitude and consequently arrives successively in atmospheric strata of densities rapidly diminishing, I say it does not appear at all reasonable that in this progress upward, the original velocity should be accelerated. On the other hand, I was not aware that in any recorded ascension, a diminution has been proved to be apparent in the absolute rate of ascent. Although such should be the case, should have been the case, if on account of nothing else, on account of the escape of gas through the balloons ill-constructed and varnished with no better material than ordinary varnish. It seemed, therefore, that the effect of such an escape was only sufficient to counterbalance the effect of the acceleration attained with the diminishing of the balloon's distance from the gravitating center. I now consider that provided in my passage I found the medium I had imagined, and provided that it should prove to be essentially what we denominate atmospheric air, it could make comparatively little difference at what extreme state of rarefaction I should discover. That is to say, in regard to my power of ascending, for the gas in the balloon would not only be itself subject to similar rarefaction, in proportion to the occurrence of which I suffer an escape of so much would be requisite to prevent explosion, but being what it was, would at all events continue specifically lighter than any compound whatever of mere nitrogen and oxygen. Thus there was a chance, in fact there was a strong probability that at no epoch in my ascent I should reach a point where the united weights of my immense balloon, the inconceivably rare gas within it, the car and its contents, should equal the weight of the mass of the surrounding atmosphere displaced. And this would be readily understood as the sole condition upon which my upward flight would be arrested. But if this point were even attained, I could dispense with ballast and with other weight to the amount of the nearly 300 pounds. In the meantime, the force of gravitation would be so constantly diminishing in proportion to the squares of the distances, and so with the velocity prodigiously accelerating, I should at length arrive in those distant regions where the force of the Earth's attraction would be superseded by that of the Moon. There was another difficulty, however, which occasioned me to some little disquietude. It has been observed that in balloon ascensions to any considerable height, besides the pain attending respiration, great uneasiness is experienced about the head and body, often accompanied with bleeding at the nose, and with other symptoms of an alarming kind, and with growing more and more inconvenient in proportion to the altitude attained. This was a reflection of a nature somewhat startling. Was it not probable that these symptoms would increase until terminated by death itself? I finally thought not. Their origin was to be looked for in that progressive removal of the customary atmospheric pressure upon the surface of the body and the consequent distension of the superficial blood vessels, not in any positive disorganization of the animal system, as is in the case of difficulty in breathing, where the atmospheric density is chemically insufficient for the due renovation of blood and eventual of the heart. Unless for default of this renovation, I could see no reason, therefore, why life could not be sustained even in a vacuum. For the expansion and compression of the chest, commonly called breathing, is action purely muscular, and the cause, not the effect, of respiration. In a word, I conceive that as the body should be habituated to the want of atmospheric pressure, the sensations of pain would gradually diminish. And to endure them while they continued, I relied with confidence upon the iron hardihood of my constitution. Thus may it please your excellencies, I have detained some, though by no means all, the considerations which led me to form a project of the lunar voyage. I shall now proceed to lay before you the result of an attempt so apparently audacious in conception, and at all events so utterly unparalleled in the annals of mankind. Having attained the altitude before mentioned, that is to say 3 miles and 3/4, I threw out from the car a quantity of feathers, and found that I still ascended with sufficient rapidity. There was therefore no necessity for discharging any ballast. I was glad for this, for I wished to retain with me as much weight as I could carry. For the obvious reason, I could not be positive either about the gravitation or the atmospheric density of the moon. I as yet suffered no bodily inconvenience, breathing with great freedom, and feeling no pain whatever in the head. The cat was lying very demurely upon my coat, which I had taken off, and eyeing the pigeons with an air of nonchalance. These latter, being tied up by the leg to prevent their escape, were busily employed in picking up some grains of rice scattered for them in the bottom of the car. At 20 minutes past 6 o'clock, the barometer showed an elevation of 26,400 feet, or 5 miles to a fraction. The prospect seemed unbounded. Indeed, it is very easily calculated by means of spherical geometry how great an extent of the earth's area I beheld. The convex surface of any segment of sphere is to the entire surface of the sphere itself as the versed sine of the segment to the diameter of the sphere. Now, in my case, the versed sine, that is to say, the thickness of the segment beneath me, was about equal to my elevation, or the elevation at the point of sight above the surface. As 5 miles, then, to 8,000, as would express the proportion of the Earth's area as seen by me. In other words, I beheld as much as 16th hundredth part of the full surface of the globe. The sea appeared unruffled as a mirror, although by means of this telescope I could perceive it to be in a state of violent agitation. The ship was no longer visible, having drifted away apparently to the eastward. I now began to experience at intervals severe pain in the head, especially about the ears. Still, however, with breathing with tolerable freedom, the cat and the pigeon seemed to suffer no inconvenience whatsoever. At 20 minutes past 7, the balloon entered a long series of dense cloud, which put me up to great trouble by damaging my condensing apparatus and wetting me to the skin. This was, to be sure, a singular rencontre, for I had not believed that it was possible that a cloud of this nature could be sustained at so great an elevation. I thought it best, however, to throw out 2 5-pound pieces of ballast, preserving still greater weight of 165 pounds. Upon so doing, I soon rose above the difficulty and perceived immediately that I had obtained a great increase in my rate of ascent. In a few seconds after my leaving the cloud, a flash of vivid lightning shot from one end of it to the other, and caused it to kindle up throughout its vast extent like a mass of ignited charcoal. This, it must be remembered, was in the broad light of day. No fancy may picture the sublimity which might have been exhibited by a similar phenomenon taking place amid the darkness of the night. Hell itself might have been found a fitting image. Even as it was, my hair-stolen end, in which it gazed afar down while within the yawning abysses, letting imagination descend and stalk about it in the strange vaulted halls and ruddy gulfs and red ghastly chasms of the hideous and unfathomable fire. I had indeed made a narrow escape had the balloon remained a short while longer within the cloud, that is to say, had not the inconvenience of getting wet determined me to discharge the ballast, my destruction might and probably would have been the consequence. Such perils, although little considered, are perhaps the greatest in which must be encountered in balloons. I had by this time, however, attained too great an elevation to be any longer uneasy on this head. I was now rising rapidly, and about 7 o'clock the barometer indicated an altitude of no less than 9 miles and a half. I began to find great difficulty in drawing my breath. My head, too, was excessively painful, and having felt for some time a moisture about my cheeks, I at length discovered it to be blood, which was oozing quite fast from the drums of my ears. My eyes also gave me great uneasiness. Upon passing the hand over them, they seemed to have protruded from their sockets as if no inconsiderable degree, and all objects in the car, even the balloon itself, appeared distorted to my vision. These symptoms were more than I had expected and occasioned me some alarm. At this juncture, very imprudently, without consideration, I threw out from the car 3 5-pound pieces of ballast. The accelerated rate of the descent thus obtained carried me too rapidly, and without sufficient gradation, into a highly rarefied stratum of the atmosphere, and the result had nearly proved fatal to my expedition and to myself. I was suddenly seized by a spasm which lasted more than 5 minutes, and even when this in a measure ceased, I could catch my breath only at long intervals, and in a gasping manner, bleeding all the while copiously at the nose and ears, and even slightly at the eyes. The pigeons appeared distressed in their extreme and struggled to escape, while the cat mewed piteously, and with her tongue hanging out of her mouth, staggered to and fro in the car as if under the influence of poison. I now too late discovered that the great rashness of which I had been guilty in discharging the ballast, and my agitation was excessive. I anticipated nothing less than death, and death in a few minutes. The physical suffering I underwent contributed also to render me nearly incapable of making any assertion to the preservation of my life. I had indeed a little power of reflection left, and the violence of the pain in my head seemed greatly on the increase. Thus I found my senses would be shortly give way altogether, and I had already clutched one of the Valbaros with the view of attempting a descent, when the recollection of the trick I played on the 3 creditors, and with the possible consequences to myself should I return, operated to deter me for the moment. I lay down at the bottom of the car and endeavored to collect my faculties. In this I have so far succeeded in determining upon the experiment of losing blood. Having no lancet, however, I was constrained to perform the operation in the best manner I was able, and finally succeeded in opening a vein in my left arm with the blade of my penknife. The blood had hardly commenced flowing when I experienced a sensible relief, and by the time I had lost about half a moderate basinful, most of the worst symptoms had abandoned me entirely. I nevertheless did not think it expedient to attempt getting up on my feet immediately, but having tied up my arm as well as I could, I lay still for about a quarter of an hour. At the end of this time, I arose and found myself freely from absolute pain of any kind than I had been during the last hour and a quarter of my ascension. The difficulty of breathing, however, was diminished in a very slight degree, and I found it soon be positively necessary to make use of my condenser. In the meantime, looking forward toward the cat, who was again snugly stowed away upon my coat, I discovered to my great surprise that she had taken the opportunity to my indisposition to bring into light a litter of 3 kittens. This was a number to the addition of number on my part altogether unexpected, but I was pleased at the occurrence. It would afford me a chance to bring a kind of test to the truth of surmise which, more than anything else, had influenced me in attempting this ascension. I had imagined that the habitual endurance of the atmospheric pressure at the surface of the earth was the cause or nearly so, of the pain attending animal existence a distance above the surface. Should the kittens be found to suffer uneasiness in an equal degree with their mother, I must consider my theory in fault. But if failure to do so, I should look upon it as a strong confirmation of my idea. By 8 o'clock, I had actually attained an elevation of 17 miles above the surface of the earth. It doesn't seem to me evident that my rate of ascension was not only on the increase, but that the progression would have been apparent in a slight degree even had I not discharged the ballast which I did. The pains in my head and ears returned at intervals with violence, and still I continued to bleed occasionally at the nose. But upon the whole, I suffered much less than I might have been expected. I breathed, however, at every moment, with more and more difficulty, and each inhalation was attended with a troublesome spasmodic action of the chest. I now unpacked the condensing apparatus and got it ready for the immediate use. The view of the earth at this period of my ascension was beautiful indeed. To the westward, to the northward, to the southward, as far as I could see, lay a boundless sheet of apparently unruffled ocean, which at every moment gained a deeper and deeper tint of blue. At a vast distance to the eastward, although perfectly discernible, extended the great islands of Great Britain and the entire Atlantic coast of France and Spain, with a small portion of the northern part of the continent of Africa. Of individual edifices, not a trace could be discovered, and the proudest cities of mankind had utterly faded away from the surface of the earth. What mainly astonished me in the appearance of things below was the seemingly concavity of the surface of the globe. I had thoughtlessly enough expected to see its real convexity become evident as I ascended, but a very low reflection sufficed to explain the discrepancy. A line dropped from my position perpendicularly to the earth would have formed the perpendicular of a right-angled triangle, which at the base of which extended from the right angle to the horizon, and the hypotenuse from the horizon to my position. But my height was little or nothing in comparison with my prospect. In other words, the base and hypotenuse of the supposed triangle would, in my case, have been so long, when compared to the perpendicular, that the two former might have been regarded as nearly parallel. In this manner, the horizon of the aeronaut appears always to be upon a level with the car, but as the point immediately beneath him seems, and is a great distance below him, it seems, of course, also at a great distance below the horizon. Hence the impression of concavity. This impression must remain until the elevation shall bear so great a proportion to the prospect that the apparent parallelism of the base of the hypotenuse disappears. The pigeons about this time, seeming to undergo much suffering, I determined upon giving them their liberty. I first untied one of them, a beautiful great model pigeon, and placed him upon the rim of the wicker work. He appeared extremely uneasy, looking anxiously around him, fluttering his wings, and making a loud cooing noise, but could not be persuaded to trust himself from the car. I took him up at last and threw him up to about half a dozen yards from the balloon. He made, however, no attempt to descend as I had expected, but struggled with great vehemence to get back, uttering at the same time very shrill and piercing cries. He at length succeeded in regaining his former station on the rim, but hardly had done so when his head dropped upon his breast, and he fell dead within the car. The other one did not prove so unfortunate. To prevent his following the example of his companion, and accomplishing a return, I threw him downward with all my force, and was pleased to find him continue his descent, with great velocity, making use of his wings with ease, and in a perfectly natural manner. In a very short time he was out of sight, and I have no doubt he reached home in safety. Puss, who seemed in a great measure recovered from her illness, now made hearty meal of the dead bird, and then went to sleep with much apparent satisfaction. Her kittens were quite lively, and so far evinced not the slightest sign of any uneasiness. At 8:15, being able to no longer draw breath without the most intolerable pain, I proceeded forthwith to adjust around the car the apparatus belonging to the condenser. This apparatus will require some little explanation, as your excellencies will please to bear in mind that my object, in the first place, was to surround myself in the car entirely with barricade against the highly rarefied atmosphere in which I was existing, with the intent of introducing some within this barricade by means of my condenser, a quantity of the same atmosphere sufficiently condensed with the purposes of respiration. With this object in view, I had prepared a very long, strong, perfectly airtight but flexible gum elastic bag. In this bag, which was of sufficient dimensions, the entire car was in a manner placed. That is to say, the bag was drawn over the whole bottom of the car, up its sides, and so on, along the outside of the ropes and to the upper rim or hoop where the network is attached. Having pulled this bag up in its way and formed the complete enclosure on all sides, and on the bottom it was now necessary to fasten up its top or mouth by passing its material over the hoop of the network. In other words, between the network and the hoop. But if the network were separated from the hoop to admit this passage, what was to sustain the car in the meantime? Now the network was not permanently fastened to the hoop, but attached by means series of running loops or nooses. I therefore undid only a few of these loops at a time, and leaving the car suspended by the remainder, having thus inserted a portion of the cloth forming the upper part of the bag, I refastened the loops, not to the hoop, for that would have been impossible since the cloth now intervened, but to a series of large buttons affixed to the cloth itself about 3 feet below the mouth of the bag, the intervals between the buttons having been made to correspond to the intervals between the loops. This done, a few more of the loops were unfastened to the rim, a farther portion of the cloth was introduced, and the disengaged loops were then connected with their proper buttons. In this way, it was possible to insert the whole upper part of the bag between the network and the hoop. It is evident that the hoop would now drop down within the car, the whole weight of the car itself, with all its contents, would be held up merely by the strength of the buttons. This at first sight would have seemed an inadequate dependence, but it was by no means so, for the buttons were not only very strong in themselves, but so close together that a very slight portion of the whole weight was supported by any one of them. Indeed, that had the car and contents been 3 times heavier than they were, I should not have been at all uneasy. I now raised up the hoop again within the covering of the gum elastic and propped it up at nearly the former height by means of 3 light poles prepared for the occasion. This was done, of course, to keep the bag distended at the top and to preserve the lower part of the network in its proper situation. All that now remained was to fasten up the mouth of the enclosure, and this was readily accomplished by gathering the folds of the material together and twisting them up very tightly and on the insides by means of kind of a stationary tourniquet. In the sides of the covering thus adjusted around the car had been inserted 3 circular panes of thick but clear glass, through which I could see without difficulty around me in every horizontal direction. In that portion of the cloth forming the bottom was likewise a 4th window of the same kind, and corresponding with a small aperture in the floor of the car itself. This enabled me to see perpendicularly down, but having found it impossible to place any similar contrivance overhead, on account of the peculiar manner of closing up the opening there, and the consequent wrinkles in the cloth, I could see no object situated directly in my zenith. This, of course, was a matter of little consequence, for had I even been able to place a window at the top, the balloon itself would have prevented my making any use of it. About a foot below, on the other sides of the windows, was a circular opening, 3 inches in diameter and fitted with a brass rim adapted in its inner edge to the windings of the skew. In this rim was screwed the large tube of a condenser, the body of the machine being, of course, within the chamber of the gum elastic. Through this tube, a quantity of the rare atmosphere circumjacent being drawn by means of a vacuum created in the body of the machine, was then discharged in a state of condensation. To mingle with the then thin air already charged, already in the chamber, this operation being repeated several times, at length filled the chamber with atmosphere proper for all purposes of respiration, but until confined a space in would short time be unnecessarily become foul and unfit for the use of frequent contact with the lungs. It was then ejected by a small valve at the bottom of the car, thence air already readily sinking into the thinner atmosphere below. To avoid the inconvenience of making a total vacuum at any moment within the chamber, this purification was never accomplished all at once, but in a gradual manner. The valve being opened only for a few seconds, then closed again, until 1 or 2 strokes from the pump of the condenser had supplied the place of the atmosphere ejected. For the sake of experiment, I put the cat and the kittens in a small basket and suspended it outside the car to a button at the bottom, closed by the valve, through which I could feed it in a moment when necessary. I did this at some little risk, and being close before closing the mouth of the chamber by reaching under the car with one of the poles before mentioned, to which a hook had been attached. As soon as dense air was emitted in the chamber, the hoop and poles became unnecessary. The expansion of the enclosed atmosphere powerfully distending the gum elastic. By the time I had fully completed these arrangements and filled the chamber as explained, it was wanted 10 minutes of 9 o'clock. During the whole period of my being thus employed, I endured the most terrible distress from difficulty of respiration, and bitterly did I repent in the negligence, or rather foolhardiness, of which I had been guilty, of putting off at the last minute a matter of so much importance. But having at length accomplished it, I soon began to reap the benefit of my invention. Once again I breathed with perfect freedom and ease. And indeed, why should I not? I also was agreeably surprised to find myself in a great measure relieved from the violent pains which had hitherto tormented me. A slight headache, accompanied with a sensation of fullness of distension about the wrists and ankles of the throat, was nearly all of which I had now to complain. Thus it seemed evident to me that a great part of the uneasiness attending the full removal of the atmospheric pressure had actually worn off, as I expected, and that much of the pain endured for the last 2 hours should have been attributed altogether to the effects of the deficient respiration. At about 20 minutes before 9, that is to say a short period to my closing up the mouth of the chamber, the mercury attained its limit, or rather down, and the barometer, which I had mentioned before, was also an extended construction. It then indicated an altitude of my part of 132,000 feet, or 25 miles, and I consequently surveyed that at the time of an extent of the Earth's area amounting to no less than the 320th part of its entire superficies. At 9 o'clock, I had again lost sight of the land on the out to the eastward, but not before I became aware that the balloon was drifting rapidly to the north-northwest. The ocean beneath me still retained its apparent concavity, although my view was often interrupted by the mass of clouds which floated to and fro. At 9:30, I tried the experiment of throwing a handful of feathers through the valve. They did not float as I expected, but dropped down perpendicularly like a bullet en masse, with the greatest velocity, being out of sight for a very few seconds, and I did not at first know what to make of this extraordinary phenomenon, not being able to believe that my rate of ascent had all of a sudden met with so prodigious an acceleration. But it soon occurred to me that the atmosphere was now far too rare to sustain even the feathers, that they actually fell, as they appear to do, with great rapidity, and that I had been so surprised by the united velocities of their descent and my own elevation. By 10 o'clock, I found that I had very little occupy my immediate attention. Affairs went on swimmingly, and I believed that the balloon to be going upward with a speed of increasing momently, although I had no longer any means of ascertaining the progression of the increase. I suffered no pain or uneasiness of any kind, and enjoyed better spirits than I had at any period since my departure from Rotterdam, busying myself now in examining the state of my various apparatus, and now in regenerating the atmosphere within the chamber. This latter point I determined to attend to at regular intervals of 40 minutes, more on account of the preservation of my health than from so frequent a renovation being absolutely necessary. In the meanwhile, I could not help making anticipations. Fancy reveled in the wild and dreamy regions of the moon. Imagination, feeling herself for once unshackled, roamed at will among the ever-changing wonders of a shadowy and unstable land. Now there were hoary and time-honored forests, and craggy precipices, and waterfalls tumbling with a loud noise into abysses without a bottom. And then I came suddenly into still noonday solitudes, where no wind of heaven ever intruded, and where vast meadows of poppies and slender-looking lily flowers spreaded themselves out at a weary distance, all silent and motionless forever. Then again I journeyed far down into another country where it was all one dim and vague lake with a boundary of clouds, but my fancies were such as these were not the sole possessors of my brain. Horrors of a nature so most stern and appalling would too frequently obtrude themselves upon my mind, and shake the innermost depths of my soul with the bare supposition of their possibility. Yet I would not suffer my thoughts for any length of time to dwell upon these latter speculations, rightly judging the real and palpable dangers of the voyage sufficient for my undivided attention.